Good evening, everybody. Welcome to St. John the Baptist here in Excelsior. My name is Jim Horniker, and I'll be your MC tonight. So when I was preparing to be MC tonight, my wife Andrea said to me, Jim, don't try to be too charming, too witty, too intellectual. Just be yourself. This is the third of our four presentations in our inaugural series honoring our former and beloved pastor, Father Mark Dosh, in his love of learning. Our series this year focuses on the four marks of the church, the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. These four marks are four essential characteristics of the church that Jesus founded. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, 17 centuries ago, included these four marks in our creed that we recited in every Mass since then, or every Sunday Mass since then, over the past 17 centuries. Tonight our focus is on the word Catholic, on the church being Catholic. The word comes from the Greek word katholikos, which means universal, which tonight's speaker will give us a sense of the church universality through her own life experience. Our guest speaker tonight is Debbie Herbeck, a woman whose own life was radically changed when, as a young Jewish woman, she encountered the Messiah. Debbie is an author and speaker, and for the past 38 years, she has evangelized and discipled young women through camps, mission trips, retreats, Bible studies, and small groups. Debbie is the founder and director of Pine Hills Girls Camp and Be Love Revolution, two ministries seeking to help young women know the transformative love of Christ and bring God's love to the world. She and her husband, Peter, live in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and they have 4 young adult children and 7 adorable great-grandchildren, and she showed me the pictures to prove it. Debbie will speak until about 8 o'clock, at which time we will have a time of adoration. Music during adoration will be provided by Dr. Jacob Benda on organ. Welcome back, Dr. Jacob. And Angel Andres on violin. Confessions will be available at that time as well. At 8:30, we will make our way into the gathering place for a question and answer session with Debbie, as well as with some fellowship back there. I've watched Debbie on YouTube, and I'm very excited that she's joining us here tonight. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Debbie Herbeck.
All right, I'm going to have to come to you. Can everyone see me? Is this okay? All right, I feel more comfortable being down here than kind of up there in the spotlight. We'll let Jesus be up there all alone. So I'm very glad to be here tonight. If I look awkward, it's because I never wear high heels, so I'll try not to look as awkward as I feel right now. But special treat for me to be here. My son and daughter-in-law actually live in the Minneapolis area with their 4 young children, so it's always a treat for me to be invited to come and speak in the area so that I can spend time and visit them. And it's always a treat to come when the snow isn't flying and it's not the polar vortex, so I can actually get in and out. But I'm super glad to be here. I heard you had some pretty big hitters the last couple times. Was anyone at any of the other talks? Okay, so last time was Father Jacques Philippe, is that correct? Okay, he's amazing. I've heard him speak. And before that was Jeff Cavins. Oh, my goodness. Okay, a little intimidating. Tonight, I really want to just tell you my own story. So it's going to be less kind of theological head stuff and more the story from my own experience, more how I really met Jesus. Spoiler alert, which he gave. You heard the punchline already to my story. But I want to tell you how I got there and how a nice Jewish girl like me finds herself in a church speaking about Jesus. So I grew up in a Jewish home on the south side of Chicago with Jewish parents and Jewish grandparents and Jewish friends and Jewish neighbors and Jewish schoolmates. Everyone I knew in the world was Jewish. And so I thought everyone in the world was Jewish. Did anyone ever have that experience growing up Catholic? Okay. Because we lived in a Jewish neighborhood and went to a Jewish school, I really didn't know anything about Jesus except that he was the head of a major religion. My grandparents on my father's side, well, let me back up. Does anyone have Jewish friends or know Jewish people? Okay, some of you do. Okay, you know me now, so I count. But my grandparents on my father's side were very well known in the Jewish community in Chicago. They were Zionists, this is even before I was born, but they were very involved with Israel becoming a state. And so before I was born, my grandfather was the synagogue president, and my grandmother was the president of the largest Jewish charitable organization in the world called Hadassah. And because there were so many Jews in Chicago, I think she single-handedly spearheaded the raising of millions of dollars for the state of Israel. So I tell you all this to get a sense of what my life was like growing up as a young child. My grandparents went to Israel all the time. They were friends with people and these names may not mean anything to you, but they were friends with people who really were founders of the state of Israel. Moshe Dayan, Yitzhak Rabin, Golda Meir. And so I grew up with the center of my life, my heritage, my cultural identity being very, very Jewish. And I couldn't separate that from my religious beliefs. This was who I was. I was Jewish. And if I didn't remember it or didn't know it well enough, my grandfather was there to remind me of that. So I have many, many wonderful memories of being in my grandparents' home on Passover, celebrating the Passover with a Seder, and there being a room full of Russian immigrants who were there celebrating with us. So very rich upbringing, very rich heritage. I am one of 4 children. I have an identical twin sister. And I remember growing up, my grandfather, her name is Dana, and he would always say, "Are you or your sister?" It would always kind of trip us up. And then I had an older brother, Mark, who was 2 years older, and a younger brother, David. And so we grew up in this very tight Jewish community, and when I was about 9 or 10 years old, most of the Jews in our neighborhood on the south side of Chicago migrated to the North Shore. So that was most of my memory growing up, was on the North Shore of Chicago. And like I said, my time growing up was really filled with this sense of being a Jew. And I remember when I got to the age of about 12 or 13, my grandfather took my sister Dana aside. We were preparing for our bat mitzvah. How many of you know what a bar mitzvah is or have heard of it? Okay. It's very similar, I guess, in a certain sense, to confirmation. It's a rite of passage for young people and for young Jewish boys or girls. When you're approaching the age of 13, you spend almost a year studying with a rabbi, and you are given a passage in Hebrew from the Torah, from the 5 books of Moses, and you're taught how to chant that passage in Hebrew. And then on your big day, not with a whole class, but just one person, or my sister and I did it together on a Saturday, you stood up in the synagogue on the bima, on the altar. You chanted that portion in front of all your friends, the whole congregation, all your family. And essentially, you stood there and you said, "I am now, as a 13-year-old, ready to be an adult member of the Jewish faith," which is really a joke because you're 13 years old. And for many Jewish kids, like Catholic kids, it's a way that gives them permission to exit the faith rather than to dive deeper into their faith. And that was certainly the mindset that my sister and I had when we were turning 13. But I remember my grandfather around that age calling us into his study and saying, "Now you're getting to the age where you're starting to notice boys, and I just want to tell you that you're not allowed to date a Gentile boy because Jews don't marry Gentiles." Now, that's probably the wrong thing to say to girls who are beginning to be interested in boys, because that's exactly the boys that we went after, or were going after us. We're the Gentiles' boys. But the message was loud and clear. We are Jews, and the most important thing about us is our Jewish identity, and we do nothing to compromise that Jewish identity, because it's important as a people that we remain Jewish. And that message that I heard will come into play later in my story. My sister and I were bat mitzvahed together, and at the end, of that time, we went to my father and said, so, can we be done now with going to Hebrew school and going to synagogue on Saturdays? And we want to be normal kids. We want to be out playing sports. We want to be at the mall doing the things that kids are doing on Saturdays. And my father said, I'm a Jew. My father was a Jew. My grandfather was a Jew. His grandfather was a Jew. Have you ever seen Fiddler on the Roof? Tradition. Basically, he was saying, you will live this way as long as you're living under my roof. You will be a Jew, and you will observe what it means to be a Jew. So just a little bit about what I was like growing up during that time, junior high and high school. I was very shy. My sister and I, because we were identical twins, had our own kind of little world and little language together, and people always say, what was it like to be an identical twin? And I don't know anything different. So it was wonderful for me to have somebody who knew me so well. Played sports. We ended up going to a very large high school in Highland Park, Illinois, which is on the North Shore, which was mostly Jewish kids there, and it was a college prep high school. What I would say is my identity as a Jew was very strong. But if you had said to me, who is God to you? How does God weigh into your everyday life? I would have said, I have no clue. So there was a big disconnect from what I practiced in terms of my cultural and my heritage and what I was doing in the synagogue and what I actually believed about who God was, which I don't think is that uncommon for a young person, but definitely God was not something that was relevant to my own life. When I was 15, I was a sophomore in high school, and my brother Mark was a freshman in college. In December of that year, my sister and I were invited, my sister Dana and my brother Mark, the three oldest kids, were invited to go on a vacation with some of our cousins over Christmas break. And the plan was that my sister and I would fly out of O'Hare Airport and meet my brother later in Florida because he was going to be driving home from a final that he had to take. And so we got to the airport and in Florida, and we were met at the gate. Do you remember when you could be met at the gate? Some of you do. We were met at the gate by some family friends that we weren't expecting to see. And they said, your parents just called, and they'd like you to come back to our house with us. Your brother was in a car accident on his way home from school. And so we went back to these friends' house and waited. And we didn't have very much information about what had happened with my brother, but I remember going outside. They had like a built-in swimming pool on their patio. And I remember stepping outside and just standing next to the pool. And I remember praying for the first time in my life. Now, I had grown up in synagogue. I knew lots of prayers by heart, but it was the first time that I tried to talk to God. And I remember standing there next to the pool and saying, God, I don't know who you are. I don't know if you can hear me or if you care. But if you are there, save my brother's life. And I remember it was like throwing that prayer into the deep end of the pool and not knowing if that prayer was going to even work. And a few minutes later, after I prayed that prayer, the phone rang in the house, and my mom's friend came out and told us what had happened to my brother. He was traveling home on a 2-lane highway in Illinois on his way home on a snowy road, and he was run off the road by a semi-truck, wasn't wearing his seatbelt, was in a very, very violent accident, and was taken to a small hospital nearby and essentially died before my parents could get there. And I remember hearing the news, and the first thing I thought was, God, where are you? Don't you care? Where are you right now? So my sister and I were put on a plane the next morning, sent back to Chicago to our grieving family who had just lost their firstborn son. And my parents just were in really no shape to help us deal with this tragedy. But in the Jewish faith, there's many customs and rites of mourning, and there's something called sitting Shiva, which is you're in your home and the rabbi comes and people come with gifts and with food, and there's times of prayer together, and you just share your grief together. And so for the next few days, our home was filled with people. And I remember going around, and this is as, a 15, almost 16-year-old, going around and just asking everybody I knew there all the questions that were burning inside me. Like, why does God allow horrible things to happen to good people? What happens when we die? Where is God in all of this? And every time I went to one person, whether it was a teacher or an uncle or a cousin, they would always point me to the next person. Until finally somebody said to me, I think it was my aunt, she said, "Why don't you talk to that guy?" And I looked across the room, and sitting in the corner was the rabbi. And he was like 100 years old. And I went up to him, and I was angry, and I was distressed, and I began to kind of pour out all these questions before him, and he just sat there for what seemed like forever. He didn't say anything. And then finally he looked at me, and he said, "I don't know. I don't know what happens when we die. I don't know why God allows suffering. I don't know." And I was just stunned, because I thought, you represent my faith to me, and if you don't know, and you're the last guy in the room that I'm talking to, maybe there aren't answers. And so the next few years that I had left in high school were really very, very difficult years. I would say I kind of spent them two ways. During the week, I was just studying furiously because I wanted to get into a really good university, and I wanted to get out of my home and just start my life apart from my family and the grief that I was experiencing at home. And then on the weekends, I was doing all sorts of things to just help me kind of block out the grief and deal with the pain that I was going through, things that weren't good things. And so I got in my head around middle of junior year, third of the way through junior year, that I wanted to go to the University of Michigan. Are there any Wolverine fans in the crowd? All right, go blue. And I don't know why. I was pretty shy. Michigan is a huge school, but I decided I wanted to go there. So my sister and I applied together. And I remember the day the acceptance letter came with only my name on it. And we realized in that moment that we were not going to be sharing everything for the rest of our lives. And so my sister ended up going to Indiana, and I went to Michigan, and because she didn't get into Michigan. And I remember the night before we were leaving for college, my mom said, "Go to your room," because we had shared everything our whole lives, clothing, friends, boyfriends, everything. Just want to make sure you're still awake. Did you hear that? Oh, okay. And she said, "Divide up everything you own and don't come out until you're finished." And so for hours, we went through all of our clothing and down to the last pair of socks. And it was just very symbolic, because for the first time in our life, we were going to be going our separate ways. And so I thought, okay, no big deal. There's lots of Jews at the University of Michigan. I'm going to meet a lot of them, and it'll be fine. And so my parents drove me up. I didn't even visit the school. That's how desperate I was to get away. I mean, it's a good school. It was a good choice, but I didn't even visit it. They drove me to a dorm, and they started unpacking the stuff, and I was so dramatic. I was like, "Just go." And they, dropped all my stuff, and I took it upstairs, and I began to walk up and down the hall, because it was a freshman hallway. And I was looking at all the names on the doors of all the girls, and I'm like, nope, no Kaplans, no Rosensteins, no. I just went through all the names. I was like, there are no Jewish kids on this floor. And you say, how do you know? Well, if you're Jewish, you know. Are there any Italians? So, all right, same thing, okay? I just knew there were no Jewish girls. So I was rooming blind. I hadn't, just didn't know the girl I was rooming with. And her name was Lori Brown, so I knew she wasn't Jewish. And I went into my room, and like I said, I was fairly shy. And Lori had been there for a whole day, so her whole side of the room was set up. And I remember going over to her and just starting to make small talk, and she had a picture on her dresser. And I remember just to make small talk, I said, "Oh, that guy's kind of cute. Is he your boyfriend?" And she looked at me, and I'm pretty sure she was thinking, "You got into school here?" But she said, "You don't know who that is?" And I'm like, "No." I mean, this is in the mid-'70s, okay? So cut me a little bit slack here. But she said, "That's Jesus." And then she said something even weirder. She said, "And he is my boyfriend." So I thought, okay, you're weird. This is going to be a long year. Beach Boy Jesus. There he is. I don't think he'll stand up, but we'll give it a shot. All right. So here's what I found out about Lori Brown. Freshman year. Go to the University of Michigan. There's 40,000 students in the undergrad students. You know, a good percentage are Jewish. Lori Brown grew up Catholic. Her senior year of high school, she met a bunch of people who were really on fire with their faith. She ended up taking a course called the Life in the Spirit Seminar, really got deep into her faith life, and came to the University of Michigan determined to live her faith as a committed Catholic. Here I am. I'm a Jewish girl. I've never met anyone who cares anything about their faith. I don't know anything really about Christianity, and I get put in this tiny dorm room with this Jesus freak. But one of the things I have to commend Lori, she really was pretty cool about not harassing me, not talking about her faith very much, and so we began to develop a friendship and get along. But there was another girl that lived in my hall. Her name was Sarah, and she really was a Jesus freak. She played guitar. You can't even do this anymore in a secular university, but she would walk up and down the hallway with her guitar, knock on people's doors, and say, "Hey, anyone want to hear a song about Jesus?" And she was one of the most, how do I say this? I never met anyone like her who cared so little in such a good way about what other people thought about her. She was one of the freest people I had ever met. And she and I struck up this very unlikely friendship because we shared one thing in common, and that's we were both athletes, and we liked to play sports and go to the gym together, and so we struck up a friendship. And we began to have these kind of random debates about faith. Now, Sarah was also a Catholic who was really trying to live her faith, and we began to have debates about the Bible. So she was Catholic. She didn't know that much about the Scripture. And I was Jewish, and I only knew what I had learned, kind of the stories in the Bible. And so we kind of go back and forth, but never really talk specifically about who Jesus was. Well, that first semester, we were both living in the dorm together, and I was taking a class. I was an English major, and I was taking a class called Great Books. And one day the professor came to class, and he said, I would like you to read the book of Romans and write an essay on it. We were studying, first century writings. And I went to him after class and I said, I didn't see the book of Romans on the book list. And he kind of rolled his eyes. He said, it's in the new Bible, in the New Testament. And I said, I'm not allowed to have one of those. And he said, I don't care. Find a New Testament and do the assignment. And so I went to my friend Sarah's room and I explained the situation. I asked her if I could borrow her Bible because I had seen it in her room before. And she was like, sure, you can borrow my Bible. She said, I want to warn you, the book of Romans is really difficult, so I'm really glad to help you if you need help with this assignment, but take it back to your room and read it and let me know. And she goes, I'll put the little ribbon in where Romans is so you can find it. So I took the Bible back to my room. This is it, the Bible. And I was astonished for several reasons. One is that it had her name on the cover. Like, Jews just don't put their name on the cover of Bibles because Jews don't have personal Bibles. You hear the scriptures are read in the synagogue, and they're considered so holy that if I were to drop this to the ground right now, I would need to pick it up and kiss it in reverence for God's word. Isn't that beautiful? Really beautiful. So I began to look at Romans, and I read about 3 paragraphs, and I was totally lost. I was like, where are the cliff notes for this? I didn't know who Paul was. I didn't know who Jesus was. I had no context for what was being talked about. Romans is hard. It's still a really hard book to read. And so I gave up, and I began to just flip around her Bible, and I thought, wow, my Bible's in her Bible. That would be the Old Testament or the Scriptures. And then I was amazed because I realized that not only did this Bible have her name on the cover, she actually read it. And a strange thing was happening when she read it, which I could tell by just looking at it, was that this was speaking back to her. And as I looked through some of the New Testament, and I wasn't reading the words, I was just noticing she had underlined most of it. She had written in the margins. Can't show you very well without it falling apart, but she wrote in the margins, she ran out of space, she wrote on the back, she wrote on the maps, she wrote prayers, she wrote things she was hearing, she wrote things she was seeing, and I felt like I was reading someone's personal diary. Like there was a dialogue going on between the author of this book and between the one who was reading it. And all along, I thought the Scriptures were just made-up stories. And I was astonished, and I had this clear sense that if I began to read this book, there's some power at work here that might exert some influence over me. And I just remember kind of giving it back to her and saying, here, take it back. Well, moving on, how's everyone doing? Good? Attention level good? All right, I'm going to check my watch here, which may or may not be working. Just to keep us on track. It's 25 too? All right, thank you. 25 after? Okay. About almost, I think it was March of my first year, my freshman year, Sarah and I continued our friendship. About March, it was Lent. I didn't know it was Lent back then, but it was Lent, and some girls came to my dorm room and said, we're going to take a study break and watch a movie. Would you like to join me? So I said, sure. And so one of them was Sarah, and we went to a lounge in our dorm, and it was just a big carpeted room, and a bunch of people were gathering there, and they were showing something on TV, a movie on TV. And so we all sat down on the carpet, and the movie begins to come on, you know, the credits or whatever, and I whispered to my friend Sarah, what movie is this? And she's like, oh, it's nothing. I'm like, okay. And then the title comes on, Jesus of Nazareth. Has anyone ever seen that movie? Have you? It's the one where Jesus never blinks. Seriously, go back and watch it during Lent. He never blinks. And immediately I thought, I got to get out of here. Again, my grandfather, he won't help me with my tuition if he ever finds out that I'm watching Jesus of Nazareth. I just felt such a sense of like betrayal that I was even watching something about Jesus. But because I was rather shy and inhibited, the thought of kind of getting up and making a scene, I sat there as the movie began to unfold. Now, I had never read the Gospels. I didn't really know who Jesus was, any particulars about his life. And the story of his life begins to unfold. In like 5 minutes, I turned to my friend Sarah, and in astonishment, I whispered to her, he's Jewish. You all know that, right? Okay, just checking. And she looks at me like, yeah, and I'm thinking, wow, that is like the best kept secret ever. Do all Jews know that Jesus was a Jew? Yeah, I mean, yeah. I'm really like, yeah, after showing you the picture and me not knowing Jesus was Jewish, it's just like I was very sheltered in all of this. And as the story begins to unfold, this is a Hollywood version of Jesus' life. I didn't know anything different. I watched as he went to the synagogue. I watched as he, listened to his mother. He was a good Jewish boy. And I thought, not only is he Jewish, He's a good Jew. He's a mensch. He's a good Jew. And I was astonished because my whole life I had experienced this huge chasm between myself as a Jew and the Christian world. And now here was a man who represented Christianity, and he wasn't one of them, he was one of us. And I can't tell you exactly what was going on in my heart and my mind in that time, but I was drawn to this person of Christ. Not the actor, but who he was portraying. And I don't know how to say it, except there was something about him that I wanted to be like, and I knew that I didn't have the power in my own life to be that way. The movie was wrapping up for the night, because it was like almost 10 o'clock, and there's a scene. It was going to be shown in 2 parts, and there was a scene in the movie where Jesus comes to a village, the village of Bethany, and he's met at the village by a woman who begins to weep. And she says, "Lord, where were you? If you had been here, our brother would not have died." It's the story of Martha and Mary. Now, you know the end of the story, and I didn't. And as soon as I heard that, it was like a script, a dialogue from my own life. And immediately I wanted to just really get up and run out of the room. And honestly, I felt like some invisible force was just holding me there, saying, "Just wait, just watch." And I watched as Jesus in the movie goes to the tomb of his friend Lazarus, who's been dead more than 3 days. And I knew as a Jew that Jesus had no business being at that tomb because it was ritually impure to be around the dead. And I watched as he goes in and he raises Lazarus from the dead. And I sat there and I thought, who is this guy? Is he the one? When Jews say, is he the one, that means, is he the Messiah? Could he be the Messiah? Who is this man who has power over death? And I went back to my room that night and I could not sleep. And I walked all the way down the hallway to my friend Sarah's room. It was like 1 a.m, and I knocked on the door. And she just opens the door. I didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. And she just put the book out. Talk about being ready. Wow. Put the book out. So I take it back to my room and I sit down in my beanbag chair in my dorm room and I read the gospel right where that ribbon was. I read the gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I read the story of Jesus' life and I get to the place in the Gospel of John where Jesus says, the scene I just witnessed, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will not die, but the one who believes in me will live forever." I didn't know what most of those words meant, but I knew there was a promise implicit there. And so, for the second time in my life, that night, I prayed. And I said, "God, I don't know who you are, if you can hear me, or if this man is the Messiah. But if he is, show me and give me the faith to believe." Well, guess what? Nothing happened. No one delivered a free pizza. Nothing happened that night. But that began for me a journey of stepping into a life of faith. And so I went that next morning and I gave my friend Sarah her Bible back and she said, "Why don't you keep it for a little while? And why don't you read it?" And so about 3 weeks later, I was going home for the summer with that Bible in hand and heading home after freshman year and began to read that Bible late at night like Nicodemus with a flashlight and began to read the Gospels in depth. And I was stunned by what I was reading because I thought, do Christians really believe this stuff? Like whoever is not does not hate father, mother, sister, brother, whoever does not whoever does not love me above everything else is not worthy to follow me. Whoever does not pick up his cross and follow me. I mean, I was just stunned by the call. And I began to read it, and then I began to go into the Old Testament. I began to read the prophecies in Isaiah, where it talks about who the Messiah will be. And so every night I would read that, and I would pray that prayer that I had read, that I had begun to pray. God, if you're real, show me. And if Jesus is the Messiah, give me the faith to believe. Well, I went back to, how am I doing for time? Just because my watch really is broken, so I'm good? Okay, great. So I went back to school in the fall, and I was saying to my friend Sarah, how come there aren't any other Jews that believe that Jesus is the Messiah? And she goes, oh, but there are. She goes, do you want to meet one? And I said, no, I don't. So all along, I'm searching for truth. I'm not searching to convert. I'm not searching to be a Catholic. I'm not searching to be a Gentile or a Christian. I just want to know what's true. What makes life worth living? Is there more than just what we see and what we have? I was searching for truth. So I was it was one of the holiest days of the year, the holiest day of the year for Jews. Does anyone know what that is? You get free cheese cubes later if you can answer this question. Anyone know the holiest day of the year for Jews? Yom Kippur, the MC got it. All right. I didn't even tell him that earlier. Okay, got that all on his own. Yom Kippur, which in 8 days will actually happen for the Jews. It's the holiest day of the year. It's the Day of Atonement. I was in synagogue on the campus at the University of Michigan, like a lot of other Jewish kids, seeing what everyone else was wearing and ready to report back home that I had gone to synagogue. As I'm walking out of synagogue, I literally, and I mean literally, bumped into a girl, and we began a conversation. And we walked through campus together, and as we got ready to part ways, she said, hey, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Abby. I'm from Connecticut. My grandfather's a rabbi, and when I was 17, I met someone and fell in love. I'm like, oh, okay, that's a good story. And she's like, his name is Jesus. Yeah. I was like, okay. So Abby was the first Jewish girl that I met, coincidentally, who believed in Jesus, that Jesus was the Messiah. And she and I began to have a friendship. I went home. I was continued to pray that prayer and was reading the scripture every night. And I went home. This is now my sophomore year for Thanksgiving. And I was home a half a day before my sister, and so my parents and I went out for dinner together to a Chinese restaurant, and I was just catching them up on life at the university and what I was learning, and I remember saying to my parents, hey, I've been reading the scriptures. Did you ever think Jesus could be the Messiah? You know, just kind of normal conversation. And I look over, my mom is choking on her egg roll, and my dad is like, we need to leave now. So they take me back. We go back to the house, and they call their Catholic friends. This is some business associates that my father had. And they come over, and they sit me down. These are the Catholic friends, and they're like, what are you doing? You're Jewish. You don't need to think about Jesus. Your family's very concerned about you. Yeah. Don't do this. You're going to upset them. And I call that weekend my sneak preview because I had been reading in the scriptures about counting the cost, and it was very clear to me that if I were going to choose to believe in Jesus, this was going to cost me something. My mother cried the whole weekend and then stopped talking to me for several years. And my father begged me as I went back to school not to convert. And I went back to school. This was right after Thanksgiving. And 2 days later, I had a dream. And in the dream, I was standing in a long, dark hallway, and I heard a voice call out to me, who do you say that I am? And I couldn't see anyone. It was dark. And then a second time, that voice called out to me, who do you say that I am? And I saw at the end of this corridor just the shape or an outline of a person, but I still couldn't see who it was. And then a third time in that dream, who do you say that I am? And standing before me in that dream was Jesus. And I said, "You're Jesus. You're Jesus. You're Jesus." And I woke up from that dream. Do you ever have dreams where it's just so vivid? Woke up from that dream, and I was going to the gym to meet my friend Sarah, and I'm like, I had the weirdest dream. Jesus appeared to me in my dream. Do you think there's anything to it? She was like, yeah. I said, you know what? I've done my study. I've researched this. I believe that he was a great man, that he spoke truth, that all of those things. And I have a lot of knowledge up here, but I don't have the faith conviction to make this my own, because this could cost me everything in my life that's dear to me. And she said something very wise, which was right from the scripture. She said, keep seeking, keep knocking, keep asking, because God wants to show himself to you. And so a few nights later, I was in my dorm room. We had a loft built, so I was kind of sitting up on top of the loft in front of a window, and I was praying that prayer that I had now prayed for almost 9 months. God, if you're real, show me. If Jesus is the Messiah, show me and give me the faith to believe. And that night, something incredibly dramatic happened. And if you've ever heard testimonies of other Jewish believers, this is a very common thread. I hadn't heard any, but now that I've gone back and heard some, God, and it says in the scriptures, Jews demand signs. Now, I don't know if I was demanding a sign, but God certainly knew that I needed something dramatic in order to believe. And in that moment, as I prayed that prayer, I experienced this tremendous, presence in the room with me. And I knew that it was God. I didn't know who he was, but I knew that it was God there with me. And I had this tremendous sense of awe and terror. And I remember just saying, God, I don't know who you are, but I know that I have messed up my life, that I have broken most of your commandments. That would be the 10 for the Jews. And but I said, God, if you're here, please give me another chance, because I really want to know you and I want to live for you. And as I prayed that prayer, in that moment I experienced that same Jesus that I saw in the dream was there with me. I don't know if it was a dream or a vision. I mean, I was awake, but I just knew that Jesus was there present in the room with me, and he was holding out his hand like this. And he was speaking to me, not in an audible voice, but in my heart. And he was saying, this is yours. You prayed for it and you asked for it. This is the gift of faith. And in that moment when Jesus said that to me and presented that to me, I just knew it was true. I just knew that he was the Messiah. I knew that he loved me. I knew that he died for me. I knew he had a plan for my life. I knew my life would be challenging and that I would suffer in some way because of my faith, but I knew that I knew that I knew. And so often when I talk to young people, especially like high school or college students, I always say, what do you do when Jesus shows up in your dorm room? Well, if you're smart, you pay attention and you say yes. And so that night, the faith that I had really sought after and prayed for became my own. And I stepped through that door of faith and said to God, I don't know what this will bring me, but I know that I've met you, that you're real, that you're a person, and I want to walk with you for the rest of my life. Well, a lot unfolded after that. What time we got here, MC? 18. Wow, God's multiplying the time. That's amazing. I stayed in Ann Arbor that summer to live with a bunch of other girls who were Christians so that I could begin to grow in my faith as well and really understand what it meant to really follow Jesus. I was very, very, very committed, and still am to this day, of maintaining my Jewish identity, and never saw myself as being converted but completed, as a Messianic Jew who believed in Jesus. I was baptized that summer. I began attending a Messianic congregation and was baptized that summer in a swimming pool. and began to really grow in my faith. I found out later, a few years later actually, that my parents hired a private investigator. I probably would have done the same thing. But I went home a couple of years later after a lot of separation from them that they really needed and wanted, and found a big file on me. They thought I was in a cult. They thought I was brainwashed. They thought I was unduly influenced. They thought I wasn't thinking clearly about things. They were very concerned. And so it was a very difficult time of trying to figure out how to be in my family's life on their terms. And it was part of the cost that I knew would be coming. Fast forward, there's just a lot to say, but I finished up at the university and ended up doing campus ministry at U of M, and was really trying to figure out what God wanted me to do with my life. And I spent some years just doing campus ministry and spending some time living with some sisters who were nuns. I wasn't even Catholic at this time, just trying to pursue what I thought God wanted me to do. And about this time, let me think how many years later, I don't know, 5 or 6 years later, I was working on campus at the University of Michigan, and I met a young man who also had just left the seminary and was working on campus as well. And his name was Peter. Spoiler alert there. How many of you have heard my husband speak or know who he is? Okay. So not a shy guy. He's pretty much worked for the church his whole life as a lay evangelist, preacher type. And we eventually began to date. And Peter said to me, I really like you a lot, and I really want to marry someone who's Catholic. And I said, I really like you a lot too, but I am not going to become Catholic just to marry you. And the reason I said that is because I knew that just to marry someone and become Catholic out of convenience is not a good way to go. I knew that if I was going to have children and raise them as Catholics, I wanted to raise them with a conviction of someone who loved the Catholic Church. And so I said to Peter, I'll make you a deal. I will investigate the Catholic Church, but you are not allowed to talk to me about it. And he was like, you can't influence me, you can't, coerce me, just let me be on this journey. And so I began to meet with a Catholic priest who was a mutual friend, and we began to talk about some of the issues that people who aren't Catholic face when they come into the church. Are there any converts here? Okay. So there's like 5. I don't know the big 5. What are they? There's Mary, Purgatory, the Eucharist. What else? There's like a couple more. Confession, Communion of Saints, some of that stuff. I wasn't anti-Catholic. I just didn't know that much about the church. So just to fast forward this really quick, because this is kind of, I guess, tying in the universal church, I began to meet with this priest one-on-one, and it was just wonderful. So one day, it was December, and it was the beginning of Advent, and I was in prayer, and I just was saying to God, do you have anything special for me this Advent that you want to teach me? And I clearly heard the Lord say, not in an audible voice, but felt like God was saying to me, yes, I would like to introduce you to someone named Mary. And I remember saying, Mary who? Again, Mary was not really on my radar. And so I went to Father Frank and I said, Father, I just want to tell you something that I heard in prayer. He goes, before you do that, I want to tell you something that I heard for you in prayer. He said, as I was praying for you today, God told me that he wants you to meet his mother. I said, well, I confirm that word. I heard something very similar. So what did I do? Did I go out and buy a giant rosary? No, I did not. I went to the scriptures, and I looked for Mary there. Now, she's not there all that much, but when she was there, I really began to study. And I came to a passage early on where Mary goes to be with Elizabeth in her time of need. Now, my mother was not in my life. I was really beginning a whole new phase of my life, and I felt so clearly that Mary was coming alongside me to be with me in my time of need. And something very unexpected happened. I came searching for the truth in the Catholic Church, and the church, through Mary, came searching for me. And so I began to sit in the back of a church at Mass, and I began to observe, and I was like, I watched everyone get up when the Word of God was read, and I'm like, they got that from us. And then one day the bishop happened to be there, and he was wearing a yarmulke, and I was like, they got that from us. And then I began to study the Eucharist, and I thought, this is the Passover fulfilled. It's like connecting all the dots and realizing that what was happening at our Passover table that we were celebrating for 3,000 years with Jews all over, not only the world, but throughout the generations, was the same thing that was happening every time the Eucharist was celebrated on that table. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. And so what Mary did for me was she began to make the church a home, like only a good Jewish mother can do. And so I came to the point where God showed me very clearly, I brought Peter into your life to bring you into the church, and I'm bringing you into the church to bring you into Peter's life. The two were inextricably woven together. And so we were married. We had a very fast courtship. When that man knows what he wants, he goes after it. And we began to date in October. We're engaged in February and married in May. You could do that back then in the church. And my parents brought 200 of their best friends from Chicago to Ann Arbor. We were married in a hotel because they refused to come if we were married in the church. And it was a very awkward, very stiff wedding as we professed our vows to one another in Hebrew and then professed our Catholic vows. And then the bar opened and everyone started dancing and things got a little better. But we decided with my family that we were going to build bridges. And we were going to do things that really help them know that I was not abandoning my Jewish faith, but I was completing it. And so I think one of the highlights for my father was when my son Michael, our second child, was born. He was circumcised on the 8th day in our home by a mohel. In the Jewish tradition, my father was the godfather and stood there, and I could see in his eyes, and he thought, it's going to be okay. And my children, my 4 children, my 2 boys and my 2 girls, by Jewish law, are Jewish. And they have taken that very seriously as they've been raised in their own Catholic faith. We celebrate all the Jewish and the Catholic holidays together. We talk about Jesus as the fulfillment of the Passover, of all the different Jewish holidays, and they have a tremendous sense of their Jewish identity. And so when my son Michael was married 7 years ago at the University of St. Thomas, he was married under a huppah, under a canopy. He wore a yarmulke and he said his vows in Hebrew. And I said, Mike, you don't have to do that for me. And he said, Mom, I'm doing it for me. This is important to me. So it's been such a beautiful thing to be able to merge and to meld our traditions together and to really be able to live out the reality of Jew and Gentile together, being a witness for the church and for other Jews as well. As I wrap up, I want to go back to that friend Sarah that I met in the dorm. My friend Sarah became a nun. And when she made her final vow, she said, I can only have one Bible, and really this one belongs to you. And so she gave me this Bible, and she said, whenever you tell your story, take this with you. Our oldest daughter is named Sarah, and that nun became a theology teacher at our local high school, and all my kids had the privilege of studying under her as well. So I want to just close by publicly, even though she's not here, thanking that young woman, Sarah, who many, many years ago befriended me. And often we can be intimidated about the bigness of speaking our faith to those who don't believe, particularly Jews. And she just started a friendship with me, and she loved me, and she witnessed to her faith by the way that she lived her life. And I would not be standing here today if it wasn't for her courage to do that many, many years ago, and her perseverance in it as well. So I encourage all of us, as we're facing children or grandchildren or friends or family who are not in the church or living their faith, if a young Jewish girl from the North Shore of Chicago can come to know Jesus as the Messiah, there is hope for everyone. So let's just take a minute, just a second, and bow our heads, and I'll just close us in prayer. Lord Jesus, we thank you for revealing yourself to each one of us as Messiah. Lord, I pray tonight that the revelation of who you are would go even deeper in each one of our hearts and our minds. We pray for all those who are far from you this night, Lord. Go after them. Speak your words of love, your words of truth into their lives. Send them Sarahs. Send them people who can show your love and speak your truth and live the faith. And Mother Mary, thank you for the ways that you've mothered and loved us and brought us into your home, close to the Father. Wrap your mantle of protection and love around all those we love tonight. And we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. I don't know about the rest of you, but I plan to rent Jesus of Nazareth with a clicker and just watch to see how many times he blinks during the movie. There's a tremendous story about your life, and I was fascinated by it the whole way through. Next, we're going to have adoration and benediction. Deacon Riley is going to be leading that, and then Dr. Jacob is going to be leading music as well during that time. Father Carlson will be in the confessional, so there'll be confessions available during this time as well for those of you who want to take advantage of that. And then after the adoration, I'll come back up here, and then we'll have time for fellowship back in the gathering place, along with Q&A with Debbie as well. So with that, I turn it over to Jacob and Riley.
O salutaris hostium, Just a reminder that confessions are available in the back of the church.
tantum ergo sacramentum venirem celui, in antiquum documentum novum cedat redui, prestet fides supplementum sensum defectui. Genitori genitoque lasset jubilatio, salus honor virtus quoque siner benedictio procedenti ab utraque compassit laudatio.
You have given them bread from heaven, having sweetness within it. Let us pray. O God, who under this wonderful sacrament has left us a memorial of your passion, grant us, we beseech thee, so to venerate the sacred mysteries of thy body and blood, that we may ever feel within us the fruit of thy redemption, who lives and reigns forever and ever. Amen. The divine praises.
Blessed be his most precious blood. Blessed be Jesus in the most holy sacrament of the altar. Blessed be the Holy Spirit, Pentecost. Mary, most holy. Blessed be her holy and immaculate conception. Blessed be her glorious assumption. Blessed be the name of Mary, Virgin and Mother. Blessed be Saint Joseph, her most chaste spouse. Blessed be God in his angels and in his saints. Amen.
Thank you, Jacob and Angela, for the beautiful music tonight. Before we proceed to the gathering place for refreshments, a couple of announcements. One, please join us on November 14th. Well, we have the fourth in our series on the four marks of the church. We'll have Bishop Peter Christensen, who is the Bishop of Boise, Idaho, my old hometown, and also Joan Johnson's brother. So he will be talking about the church being apostolic, which is the church's being apostolic is the chain of custody. It's the historical chain between Jesus and the apostles and us today. It's a very important mark. We look forward to spending some time with you in the gathering place for refreshments, as well as some questions and answers with Debbie. But for those of you who wish to stay in the church, please, everybody, please be quiet while you're in the church for those who want to remain here. And also, there will be confessions continuing after now. So, I think as long as we need them. So, thank you, everybody, and hope to see you in the gathering place. Ladies and gentlemen, if we could come gather around the Q&A area here, if you are willing and able to stay with us. So you can wear this over your ear.
Okay, I can hold it. Yeah, I just drove by it. I was telling him. Yeah. I enjoyed it so much. My son went to Oh, he did? And they're very integrated. Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. That's beautiful. I wish it was more like that. Yeah. I resonated with so many guys. Oh, good. So I enjoyed it. Thank you. So glad you came. Of course.
Very small. Okay. Well,
You want to ask questions?
okay, we're going to start the Q&A session now. Get your questions ready. I'll ask the first question here. I can't remember what the heck I was going to ask you. Yes, I now remember. So, considering your experiences when you were in college, and like when you were somebody asked you if you wanted to speak to somebody who had converted, and you're like no. What are some things that we can keep in mind when we talk to our Jewish friends and neighbors?
Well, the first thing is that Jews don't want to be converted. I mean, that seems very obvious, but Jews don't want to be someone's project.
I'm sorry, I have to leave. My wife is not doing well. I just wanted to thank you. And Peter and I talked several times about trying to bring him here under a former pastor, but it never came together. But I lived a block from him in New Ulm.
No way.
And we went to the same school 12 years. And then he and my sister, who was a nun for 72 years, they both received that kind of a Service of the Year award from the school.
Yeah.
You know, that Peter received.
Yes.
Yeah, and I walked by their house every day for 12 years.
Yeah, on Broadway.
Going to school.
On Broadway.
Have you been to New Ulm?
Absolutely.
Huh?
Yeah, I've been to New Ulm.
Well,
Shell's
good.
beer and all of that. Yeah. Well, I'll tell him that.
This was such a treat.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, so
invite my husband. He's a good speaker.
making it happen. So,
Thank you, sir. God bless you.
Diane is wheelchair and
Oh,
time for her to go home.
okay. Well, I'll tell Peter. Thank you. So,
Okay, we were talking about how do we best, I guess, show respect for our Jewish friends and so forth when we're talking to them, but at the same time have an openness to talking to them about our faith as well.
yeah, I mean, I think for me, somebody built a relationship and a friendship with me, which said a lot. And then I think many modern secular Jews are like a lot of secular Catholics. They don't know their faith. They don't know their scriptures very well. So if any of you have been in a Bible study where you've really, learned the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, you may know more than a Jewish person might know about their faith. And so I think just starting with what you can share in common is always a good place to start. Any really strong cultural Jew will really be able to relate to a cultural Catholic as it's something that's part of you and important to you. Whoa. So I think starting there and just building a relationship and a friendship. So.
I'll open it up to the audience here. Questions you might have. I'm going to come around because the microphone really helps with the amplification here.
Debbie, growing up in a Jewish community, after you were baptized, how did the community treat you, and what was it like after that?
Well, I was, in college and then kind of living my life after that, not at home. So it was difficult, really. I definitely felt a sense of alienation, isolation. It was very interesting after Peter and I got married. I think every parent's dream for their Jewish daughters that they're going to marry a nice Jewish boy who's a doctor, a lawyer, or something. And I married a good Gentile guy who was a lay Catholic evangelist. So we had this little thing in our home. It was like the don't ask, don't tell policy. So they never asked because they never wanted to know. So when we finally started having children and would go home, I would go home sometimes to visit my family when Peter was traveling all over the world, speaking, and they would never say, "What's Peter doing? Like, why is he in Africa right now?" So it was a very strange. It's very strange to not be able to share the most fundamental, important thing about who you are with the people you love the most. And I think that was one of the most. Is that me?
Yeah, it's
okay.
you. Let's switch microphones.
Sorry. That was one of the most painful things, I think, was feeling so alienated from my family and having things be more superficial because they just didn't want to go there. They were just afraid of what they were going to find if we actually talked about anything that was more, significant than sports or politics or, fashion or something. So.
Next question. I'll hold it.
Oh, I'm just curious what your twin sister did.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's been a challenging but good. I've been praying for my sister for 40 years. And she went through her own journey, trying to kind of find what was true. And to tell you this really brief story, because this is almost unbelievable that this happened, and I can't even go into detail about what she's kind of been through in her own life, but she's been through a lot of personal suffering the last number of years, and called me about a year ago and said, suspend your judgment until you hear the whole story. She said, I just came from, what'd she say, like a palm reader or a fortune teller or somebody like that. And I have to tell you, she called me in the middle of the day. I'm like, okay. And she said, we've never been able to have really deep conversations about faith. And she said, when I went into this fortune teller, told her I was really going through a rough time, the woman said, I have 3 messages for you. The first message was, you're supposed to know that Jesus Christ has been with you every day of your life. And so I was able, in that moment, when my sister told me that, to tell her why Jesus is acquainted with suffering and how he was a man who suffered. So I was basically able to preach the gospel to my sister. The second message was, this woman said to her, you're supposed to begin to pray this prayer every day, and I don't know what it is or where you should find it, but it's called the prayer to Saint Michael the Archangel. So I'm like, all right, I can help you with that. And then there was a third message about that she was being called to be the light. And so I basically was able to say to my sister, after 40 years of never being able to talk about faith and praying for her, to say, what are you going to do about this? And I felt a little funny because of the source of where it was coming from, and I was talking to my husband about it, and he said, God is so much more powerful and so much greater than that, and he could use even that. I thought, I wonder if this person was undercover, an undercover agent or something. But, and so she said, I guess I need to figure out who Jesus is. And so she's been exploring and reading and studying, and we've been talking, regularly on the phone about her own spiritual journey. And so, so something's going on with her, and it's just been trying to love her for 40 years and not overwhelm her and not trying to convert her, but just trying to love her and pray for her. And she's, finding her way through the way God is choosing to work in her life. So.
Next question. I think there was a hand over here. Oh, Susie.
Well, she beat me at the first question. That was about your sister. But I do have another question. Has any of the rest of your family completed their faith?
They have not. It's interesting. I'm thinking a lot about my dad today. He would have been 87 today. He passed away 7 years ago, and 10 years ago, my mom was diagnosed with cancer on her 75th birthday and given 6 weeks to live, and died 6 weeks to the day of her diagnosis. But I want to tell you, in those 6 weeks that she had before her death, God didn't bring a healing of her body, but he brought a healing to our relationship. And I was able to be with my mom when she died, with my brother and sister. And in the moment before she passed, my brother and sister turned to me and said, "Would you pray for Mom?" And so I was able to lead the prayer and pray for my mom and, whisper in her ear that God was waiting to welcome her home. And so just a lot of healing that happened between us in that relationship. And then my father died rather suddenly 3.5 years after that, and again was able to be with my father and my brother and sister when he died. And then finally, 2.5 years ago, my 102-year-old grandmother, Jewish grandmother, who was the matriarch of our family, was dying, and my grandmother just was dying because she was tired of living. She was the most amazing woman I've ever met. And I prayed for her for many, many years that somehow, living in this Jewish community, she would meet someone who could witness to her faith. And I found out she lived in a very high-end retirement community, that 2 years before she died, a woman was hired as a nurse. And this woman was a very serious Catholic who taught my grandmother how to pray the rosary, my Jewish grandmother. And so when my grandmother was dying, she looked at me and she said, "Deborah, darling," that's what she called me, "I feel like Jesus on the cross right now." And I was like, "How do you know about him?" I was thinking. And then I remembered that nurse who had taught her how to pray the rosary. And so, again, was able to be with my grandmother as she died, and, and then put all of them in God's hands and pray for healing of their souls, and that God would bring them to himself. So a lot of healing happened over the years, and especially as we began to have children and they began to have grandchildren. And my father would always say, "You're so blessed because, you just live your life, and the witness of your life, you hope, is the thing that speaks to people more than any words." So we were never allowed to talk about our faith, but I think that they saw in our kids and the way that they lived their lives, and the faith that they had, that this was authentic and this was real. So, yeah, thank you for asking.
I have another question for you. So you touched on this during your talk, but tell us a little bit more about how you keep Jewish practices or Jewish, your Jewish heritage alive in your family.
Well, I think it's nothing. In a certain way, we had to work hard at it because it's just a lot of work. Okay, I'm looking at the women right now. You know how much work the holidays are and just getting everything ready. And so, think about Christmas time. We're doubling up on the work. Okay, I mean, we're trying to celebrate Hanukkah and we're trying to celebrate Christmas. We celebrate Easter. We celebrate Passover. So, in that sense, it's a lot of work just to make that all happen. But in another sense, this is who I am. This is part of the way I've grown up. And so when when Passover rolls around, it's just what you do when you're a Jew. And so my kids have learned this is what you do when you're a Jew. And so now they're beginning to adopt those practices with their own children and teach them about it as well. And so just very grateful for not only a supportive husband, but someone who really like wants to be Jewish himself. And the kids are always like, "We're Jewish, Dad's a Gentile," which is true. So they have a lot of pride in being able to have both those things coming together, and they do come together so beautifully. And I always really encourage Catholics to study the Old Testament, because that's the roots of our faith. And if we don't study it, we don't understand that the Jews, as the Pope has said, John Paul, they're our elder brothers in the faith, and so I think there should be tremendous respect and love going both ways. So.
Next question.
What do I do?
Just talk.
Talk, okay. Well, not quite so close. Okay. I don't understand. I wonder if Judaism is more of a culture than a religion. I wonder why you were raised. I understand the religious part too, but it seems like, how come you didn't know God? As a child or as a young girl, 13-year-old, you didn't feel like you had a loving father, or that never came across apparently. Sometimes I think being a Jew is more of a cultural thing than a religious thing. If you could just explain that a little bit.
Sure. I think it's both. I think Judaism in a very unique way is a religion, an ethnicity, a culture, all wrapped together. And it's hard to kind of divide them up. And I think some Jews are more religious than other Jews. I was a modern secular Jew living in as much as I was living in a Jewish culture, I was living in a mostly secular culture, a Jewish secular culture. And so I knew about God. I knew about what I learned about God, but I didn't know him in a personal way. And I think that's true of a lot of Catholics today as well. Say they would know a lot about their faith and a lot about God, but wouldn't know him personally. And then there's a lot of Catholics that are very culturally Catholic who aren't practicing their faith or their religion. So I didn't know God because I wasn't searching and seeking after him. I'm sure he was. And now that I look back, so much of what I learned and was raised in my Jewish faith has helped me to receive more of God and to understand who he is. I'm so grateful for that. It wasn't a hindrance. It has actually been a help. So does that help at all? Okay.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Make it good.
Jane?
As at your brother's funeral, you were asking questions about why and where is Jesus, or where is God in all of this. What do the Jewish people believe happened after death? So with your mother and father.
It's a great question. Again, I think this reflects, there's a lot of different answers. There's like what biblical Judaism would teach about it. Would be that, and you see this in the scriptures, that Jews, when they die, would go to like Sheol or a resting place. And that's, it talks about in the scriptures how Jesus went to Sheol, to the places where Abraham and those people were, to kind of rescue them and bring them to himself. So that's biblical Judaism. Modern secular Jews would believe a whole range of things about it. And a lot of the secular Jews I knew just didn't believe in life after death. They believed that this was all there is. And you were given this life on earth to live a good life, and that's all there is. In a practical way, I think that's what they really believe.
So was your family, was that the Sadducees?
My family was, if you think about Judaism as, there's Orthodox, like the Hasidic Judaism, and they definitely believe in life after death, and they believe in, the coming of the Messiah. And then there's conservative Judaism, which is what my family was growing up, and then there's Reform Judaism, which would be more liberal or more on this side. So all within that is a huge range. just like in Catholicism, really, and where you fall in that. And Judaism leaves a lot of room for people to fall in that range as well. Mm-hmm.
Debbie, thank you again. We appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you. Great crowd.
Yep. One more announcement. We do have some books available for sale, including several by Debbie as well. So if you would wander over there, at least do some window shopping, if not some purchasing, that would be great. So thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. We greatly appreciate having you here. Thank you.
Thank you.